we all were just mentioning, this is probably one of the most busy weekends in New York, so we really totally appreciate you all coming here. And we're very excited to have Lillian Ball and Frank Gallagher here to talk. Culture Trashes Nature is a relatively new project of Sideshow, Richard Timperio, and me. This talk project started because Culture Nature, the title of John Bird's and my exhibition here at Sideshow a few months ago, occurred. And the first talk I organized, the word trashes was added to Culture Nature as Aviva Ramani and I discussed the implications of the talk that also included Jonathan Goodman. We look forward to doing more conversations. Yes, humans are trashing nature. From contamination of oil and gas spills on land and water, to toxic chemicals emitted from their extraction, to islands of plastic in the oceans, to pesticides killing bees, and antibiotics in drinking water, the precious life we have, and that we share with all species, is at great risk. There is a growing awareness of this, and many artists are responding to the work they make and activism. Hence, these talks here are to help spread the word about how artists are taking on environmental issues. These troubling situations are stimulating new vocabularies and art forms. Because art can be inviting, engaging, instructing, seductive, and empathetic, the arts are powerful media for spreading information and expression. Today's talk is between Lillian Ball and Frank Gallagher. Lillian is an environmental activist, land preservationist, and multimedia artist with a background in anthropology and sculpture. Her interactive video installations have been exhibited at the Anchorage, Alaska Museum, the Seville, Spain Biennial, and the Queen's Museum. Her permanent WATERWASH public projects develop creative concepts to combine stormwater remediation, wetland habitat restoration, and educational outreach. WATERWASH Mattituck was completed in 2009, and WATERWASH ABC completed in 2011. These projects clean commercial parking lot runoff before it enters the river, opens private property to public use, and was funded by the New York State Attorney General's office. Frank Gallagher, PhD, explores connections between people and landscape through land management and academic research. As Chief of Interpretive Services and Assistant Director to the New Jersey Division of Parks and Forestry, he oversaw an estuarine and freshwater wetland project. Frank has published articles regarding phytostabilization of contaminated soils to ethics of ecosystem function monetization. Here's a quote from Frank's website. Sometime in 2008, an unprecedented global demographic transition occurred. The majority of us now live in cities. This fundamental change in where we live will undoubtedly change who we are and how we come to understand natural systems. There are now over 20 urban centers that house at least 10 million people. In 1950, there were only 2. While they are generally considered the home of the best creative and artistic talent, the pioneers of groundbreaking public policy, and considerable economic drivers, they are often simultaneously the sites of abject poverty and extreme environmental degradation. If sustainability is truly a human goal, then the development of a functional land ethic must be possible within the paradox content of the urban environment. Increasingly then, urban green space will provide an experiential framework required for the development of an ecological identity, the prerequisite for a land ethic, and the practice of sustainability. We will begin this conversation starting between us, and then we'll invite your comments and questions as well. Lillian and Frank both have amazing websites that show more about their work, so you can certainly look those up. This talk is being videotaped by the filmmaker and activist Amala Lane.
Thanks, Amala.
Thank you.
So I'd actually like to start with a question about the intersection of art and science and how creating an ecological identity takes place in the areas we live in. And I'm wondering, how did you become committed to this type of work, and what is your personal connection?
Well, after being a sculptor for over 30 years, I became very involved with wetland preservation on the North Fork of Long Island, and I fell in love with a wetland area, a maritime freshwater intradunal swale, to be precise. And for a long time I thought, I can't make art anymore. It just seems so inconsequential in the reality of what's happening to our natural spaces. And for about a year I really thought long and hard about what I wanted to do, and found that images kept coming to me. Mostly they were of property line markers. You know, those pink flags, the little pink flags, and they were haunting me. And so I started to take photographs again and realized that I could really make work that addressed this issue in a way that was hopefully unique to my perspective, and that could incorporate the activism and the artistic eye and sensibility in order to reach out to people and let them know what was happening. So to make a long story short, I began to appear at meetings and to talk about things that I thought shouldn't happen. And I realized I really wanted to talk about what should happen. And that's where the idea for the WATERWASH project came together, working with planners in the town of Southold, and who also appreciated the perspective. Actually, one of the planners I worked with is a painter, and he never told anybody about it until I kind of outed him. And so the concept of being able to say yes to something and to do something positive and to be able to suggest these kinds of projects was really enough to keep me going, at least with my self-concept as an artist. So, but Frank comes from a very different background, more focused from the time you started.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm a scientist by education. But I came to realize that the intersection of science and the public have become very distant, and that the real way to get people connected to the land was emotionally, and that has a lot to do with art, the artist. But my personal story goes back to actually growing up in Bayonne, and I believe you probably all know where Bayonne is, right? And understand that you really don't need a visa to go over the bridge to get there, right? It's kind of an interesting area. But for example, I was playing one day in an area where I shouldn't have been playing, because if you know anything about Bayonne, it's a peninsula between the Newark Bay and the New York Bay. And the waterfront had long ago been usurped by the Industrial Revolution and was off limits to people of my age, of course, and to the public in general. And so when they were building Route 440 underneath the Turnpike Bridge there, they brought in a bunch of sand and created this area that was great for playing in. Had a bunch of artificial tidal creeks. And playing there one day in the, after of course the workers were gone, and I saw in the tidal creek a bunch of shiners going up the creek, and a pretty good sized striped bass was chasing it up the creek.
Food.
Food, right? So we realizing the tide was going out. You had to know when the tide was coming in and going out so you didn't get stranded out there. We built a little coffer dam and waited a little bit. The tide settled down and the fish pretty much got trapped up there, and we kicked it onto the land. And so we stood there and looked at it. We had a nice sized striped bass, right? My father was a big fisherman. I figured I'd bring it home and it would be, you know, dinner.
Keeper.
A big keeper, right?
Yeah.
So then the question became, how do I kill it? And now it's all to me. My father would do this in the past, but I'm standing there and I'm saying, well, I guess a big rock would be the best way to do that. So the fish is kind of still flapping there on the ground, and his eyeball is getting bigger, looking up at me, you know, and I'm looking down at it. I've got this big rock in my hand, and you know, somehow that eye was looking right at me, and I knew something was going on in there, and the rock was getting heavier and heavier, and I decided the fish didn't taste very good anyway. I kicked it back in the water and put it back in. It became the first of what was a very long line of that one got away stories. So I think there's something special in connecting us to a place that happens early on, and if we're lucky, it never goes away. And if we're even luckier, it happens at a time when the culture in general is ready for a change. Mm-hmm. You know, if you think about that, there are these moments of time when people, land, and change seem to make sense. You know, you put a bunch of well-educated people together, or fairly well-educated people together, you give them the ability to Twitter and tweet, but they can't buy bread. And we call that the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. You know, you were talking a little bit earlier about what happened here last year. You put a bunch of people who are well-educated, they can't find work, they realize things aren't right, and we call it Seconic Park. So those moments in history when things are ripe to change the way people think come along every so often. And I honestly believe, after working for 30 years in land management and working as a scientist and understanding the ecological functions and services that the natural systems provide for us, that we're at a moment in time when, because we're an urban species, we're beginning to realize and have the opportunity to prioritize the ecologies of the urban environment. And I think we're seeing that all over the place, from the New York Harbor to Presidio, San Francisco. We were just talking about the Austin waterfront. You know, we're seeing that type of revolution happening, and it is our entrance into reconnecting people to the land. And so that's why I feel really privileged and excited about still being able to work in that intersection, in that connection.
Lillian, the work you were doing in the Bronx deals with water runoff. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Well, one of the things that I realized was a major problem, our pollution in our waterways right now, as opposed to, say, 30 years ago when you started, is about 85% of what we call non-point source pollution. That means it's stormwater from our streets and roads and runoff from pesticides, etc., rather than being coming from a sewage treatment plant or industrial places like there were in Bayonne. And so that's a recent development that at least our consciousness has been raised about it, and it seems to be one of those situations where you can capture this water, filter it through native plant systems, recreate a kind of a filtering wetland, what we would call a treatment wetland or a green infrastructure, and make it also not only clean the pollution out of the water, but help people to understand what simple little interventions they can do, like using native plants or having permeable pavements that are not asphalt and concrete that just funnel all the pollution right into our waterways. So I began to think about things in that kind of a way and realize how if you're going to make these interventions in communities, especially the Bronx, which is, I work in the South Bronx, near Hunts Point, where there is a very, very savvy community of people who have realized over the last 10 or so years that they were living on a river and not having access to it. So by and large, they organized and demanded parks to be made there. And there have been several that have been done with this concept of green infrastructure. And I wanted to have access to these people in the community. And there are lots of ways that you can do that. I'm really curious to hear about Frank's experiences with the Liberty State Park. But for me, I don't live in the South Bronx. I mean, it's close enough so that I basically have spent the last 3 years there on a pretty regular basis. And while we were actually making WATERWASH, I was there every day for 6 or 8 months. So I made an effort to reach out to the community members in a what I considered was about as organic as I could get by working with nonprofit groups in the area. Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, The Point, Sustainable South Bronx, and the group that I ended up really being very connected to, which is called Rocking the Boat. It's a group that teaches kids to build wooden boats, beautiful wooden boats, really craftsmanship of the highest degree. And then they do environmental work on the river. And it's very important for me to find a collaborator that I can work with in terms of making these projects happen, because they often take years and years and years, as you know, to happen, and they have very many different kinds of levels of interaction with the community. But lo and behold, working with Rocking the Boat and the kids in Rocking the Boat, who are mostly high school age, high school and college age people who have made this commitment to not only build the boats, but also do the environmental work on the river. It became the whole reason I wanted to do this project, to tell you the truth. It was, I became so, if you look at my Facebook page, you'll see how much, you know, there's this funny interaction with all these wonderful kids who, you know, have gone in different directions, from law school to, you know, to Iraq to, you know, and it became more and more obvious to me how important this kind of community interaction was to the success of the project. Because without that kind of investment, the community and the kids who were, they actually were paid. We set up the grant in a way so that they could be paid. But that they had a sense of investment, so much so that the filmmaker who was doing the documentary of the project there kept saying to them, they think they made this whole thing happen. And I said, that's fine with me. That's fine with me, you know. And they had wonderful interviews with the Daily News after, you know, we finished the planting, and the kids were saying, we made our own botanical garden on the Bronx River. And I can't wait to bring my kids here. Wow. So that kind of, you know, connection to the place made a huge difference to me. There was also a wonderful man called Charles Barringer who had been photographing the area for years and years and years. He lived around the corner, and I incorporated his photographs. I actually made one of the signs which told about the birds and the bees and the plants and the whatever. The sign about wildlife had mostly his photographs on it. And a little picture of him from the park across the way taking pictures, so that he was part of the project as well. It's a very integral kind of a part of the way I work now, and you really end up caring about them, and they end up caring about the place, and it's a very different kind of interaction than I ever expected. The director of Rocking the Boat kept calling me and saying, would you like help from JP Morgan Chase? They want to come volunteer. No, I don't want them. You know, and he finally got it after a certain point. I mean, he was already doing this kind of real grassroots organizing in the community and exposing these kids to all sorts of things. I love what he had to say about it, like, we teach kids to make boats, but then the boats make the kids. So, I mean, they're just the sense of accomplishment that they have of doing something like making a boat or making a botanical garden or planting plants gives them a whole different perspective on the world. And I grew up in Maine, and I grew up, you know, in a kind of a funky place where there was a lot of nature around, and I'm sure that that's where my first experiences really overwhelmingly came from being that close to nature. But I had a very different kind of youth and growing up than these kids do, and it blew my mind how we connected, and how close I feel to them even now. So it's a very important, for me, it's a very important part of it. It's maybe the art, maybe more the art part, you know, that it is the art of how you become embedded in a community, and how these nature experiences, I mean, the Bronx River is a still pretty funky place, but it has incredible nature there. And, you know, just given half a chance, it's coming back. There's a lot of problems with what we call combined sewer outfalls there. And, you know, when there's a storm, even a ½ inch of water forces the sewage treatment plants to overflow, and they back up into the river, and there's a dynamic there that is inherent in most of our infrastructure in the Northeast that is just not the right way to go. And so they're all looking for ways to mediate these kinds of storm events and create ways that the water can be translated. So I didn't have any of these issues in my childhood, unlike Frank's experience, but I'm absolutely amazed and so impressed at how knowledgeable these kids are about the issues in their place. Partially because
did that happen because of this project, or
partially because of my project, and because of many other projects like that in the Bronx, and because they were able to, you know, Majora Carter, who's a fantastic organizer, was one of the first people 15 years ago to sort of say, we live on the river. How come we don't have any parks? And so now there are 3 or 4 parks. There are 2 or 3 other parks that are under construction, mostly Parks Department parks. I didn't really want to work with the Parks Department. You can talk to the Parks Department. I've become obsessed with my projects. I wanted it to happen faster, so I approached a commercial place to ask if we could use their private property and turn it into a public park. I thought it would be faster than the Parks Department, and I was right.
Absolutely.
Parks Department said to me afterwards, we've been trying to figure out how to work with this guy, and you've got him going, you know? But it's because of a kind of art obsession. And I think that is an interesting intersection between the way you worked with the Parks Department and in a much, yeah, you must have the patience of Job, because
that's what Jameson is for.
Yeah, and I really don't. And so I tried to find the path of least resistance, you know, which was unfortunately not the easiest way to work either, because if you have a commercial business that doesn't know anything about this and says they want to do the right thing but doesn't really have a huge commitment, a lot of what you do is educational for them too, you know, getting to know the 100 different employees at that place and getting to know their ups and downs of, you know, what they wanted to see happen there, and how it was they were perfectly happy with it as an abandoned lot, you know, and they could grow their tomatoes and nobody would bother them. But when I asked them, do you want me to make you a garden with real dirt so that you can grow your tomatoes, they said, no, people would steal our tomatoes. But they ended up doing it anyways, without my interaction. They made their own garden from leftover dirt. And it has a life, these projects have lives of their own. And in a way, I mean, that is very different from working with the Parks Department. Where the Parks Department, everything is quite well scripted. And the Liberty State Park is a fantastic place.
There are differences, but there are very similar principles, aren't there?
Yeah.
And one of the principles is nobody will sit in the 2 front seats.
Let's put them in the back.
So let's move the seats to the back.
That's a great idea.
But Lily, you mentioned 2 things that are central to the themes of both of how we work. And one is the idea that you know, people need to establish an ecological identity to understand understand who they are, who they are. You know, one of the famous quotes that I like is that you don't know who you are until you know where you are. You know, and Lillian's story about having kids saying that they're going to come back when they have kids to show what they've planted is a story that actually happened to me. I mean, 25 years ago, I'm planting trees with kids at Liberty State Park, and of course, then I actually had brown hair. I did have a ponytail at that time, and so it's, you know, it's about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I'm standing at that same spot, and a guy comes by with his kid and says, "Those are Dad's trees." You know?
How exciting!
So that's ownership. That's a sense of place. That's a sense of ecological identity, and it comes through that idea of stewardship. We also mentioned the idea that it's this intersection of public and private, and today the idea that the private sector has a responsibility to provide public space, or at least public access to spaces that have ecological value, is a new way of thinking about how we relate to the land. You know, and I believe it's become a paradigm shift in terms of that the public spaces and the parks have true value, but in an area and a time when, you know, the population is what it is, our resource extraction is what it is, that the public trust demands that clean water, clean air, and access to green space is given to everybody. And I often think that the model is moving more towards a European model, where, you know, if you walk up to my grandfather's property and you want to get to the ocean behind his property, you simply open the gate and walk through. You know, that's normal. They've been in Ireland, they've been on some tight land, everybody's owned the land for the last several thousand years, right? So the idea that you're trespassing is ridiculous. The only thing you have to do is shut the gate so the sheep don't get out. Okay? But you have the right to do that. And I think we're entering into that phase of sort of our development where we look at public and private spaces in a much different context. So I'd like to tell a little bit of a story about the public space that I've worked on, either as an administrator, scientist, or a director for the past 30 years, and that's the little place across the harbor, Liberty State Park. In size, in case you're not familiar with it, it's about the size of Central Park. It's about 1,000 acres.
It's big.
So Central Park is a little bit smaller than that in terms of actual size, but we don't tell everybody. We use 1,000 acres, but the truth is that 300 of that is either tidal mudflat or intertidal zone where you can't walk anyway, but that's our secret, right? But there's 3 phases to that park's development. The story that I told earlier about when I was younger and fishing, about that same time, a person called Morris Peasant, who was a councilman in Jersey City, saw, this is about 1957, saw that the railroads were becoming delinquent and that they were going to go under. Mm-hmm. It would be 10 years before they went totally bankrupt, but he saw that. And he's looking at this 1,000 acres sitting behind the Statue of Liberty, and he's saying that we have a derelict rail yard here, and that the picture that we're showing to the world as they come and see the Statue of Liberty is that we have this really derelict area, and that's not right. Mm-hmm. So this deserves to be public space. And he really pushed that. It was this vision that became part of the mantra of the people of Jersey City. Eventually they bought the first 100 acres. Then they convinced the state to begin, through the Green Acres program, begin to purchase land in sequence so that when the railroad was gone, the area was public lands. So that first phase came from really an internal need that, by the way, is codified in our Magna Carta, and we call it the public trust doctrine, that we have the right to the waterfront. Okay. So phase 1 starts with Morris Peasant, and starts with people wanting to really capture areas and put them back into the public hands. And then, of course, they came along and said, well, we've got to design a park and make it into the park. And Mike, Geddes, he's from New York here, who did the first park design. Yeah. Robert Geddes, and a great guy, but designed it in very much Olmsted fashion. in that there's a very much control aspect of it. The crescent shape of the walkway on Liberty State Park is meant to focus our attention to the Statue of Liberty into the harbor and to outline the entire harbor. And the walkways and the plantings that are done are meant for very specific purposes. So that's phase one. Come 10 or 15 years later, we're into the 80s now, and phase two begins where we, as a country, as a nation, as a society, proved that trickle-down economics didn't work the first time, and so we went into this recession, and the governor at the time, Governor Burns, says, well, we need private enterprise to help us develop the park and make it whole. And so the Liberty State Park Development Corporation was formed. And so you have these very two different bodies. You have a development corporation that look at deriving revenue by renting out some areas of the park for certain venues. And then you have the people who always had an advisory committee together saying, how do we protect as much green space as possible for as many people as possible? So the mantra for these people was taken directly from the early Forest Service, from the Teddy Roosevelt of our time, saying that it was the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest run.
And that meant tearing down the trees and selling them to...
Right.
Yeah.
So what we have at Liberty, we have these two competing forces, and eventually, 20 years, about 2005, we come to the conclusion that the park's development was complete, and that anything else we did there, besides the marina, besides the science center, and besides the restaurants and vendors we had there, would be an infringement upon that public trust. And so at that point, the Development Corporation, through a lot of effort and lawsuits, was dissolved. But again, it was the people of the public. It was the public that was saying that this is the time to do this. About 5 years before its dissolution, they wanted to put a golf course in the middle.
Oh, God.
Okay, this is a story that's been told 100 times in 100 different places, right?
Yeah.
So the interesting thing happened, and that was that the people of Jersey City got up and said, we don't play golf. You know what? And Governor Whitman, you know, we love you, not really, but we don't play golf. Okay? And the governor actually, yes, she was a Republican, yes, she became a questionable EPA director, but questionable, yes, but at that time she says, you know what, they don't play golf. So let's take what remains of Liberty State Park, 251 acres, and make it natural.
Nice.
Make it green, make it wetlands, make it urban forest. And so here's, in the back of my mind, I'm sitting there as the governor's making this announcement thinking, this is the area that I rummaged through the railroad tracks as a kid. This is the area that we had a boat basin out here. Now she's calling it the state dedicated natural area. So that to me is a really interesting paradigm shift, isn't it? So here we are, we're now in the third part of the development of the park, and we're saying, wait a minute. Yes, we know it's a brownfield, that it is basically has some contamination issues. We know that fortunately, because of things like recessions, that we haven't been able to develop all of the park. There's still 300 acres or so that are undeveloped. And that since 1969, or even a little bit before, when the railroads went bankrupt, there has been a natural process of assemblage, development, structure, and evolution that's taken place there. And that perhaps in that legacy, in that ecological legacy, that is a result of our historic legacy of the peopling of this country, greeted by the Statue of Liberty, processed on Ellis Island, and then sent to their new homes through the railroads of the Central Railroad Terminal, that ecological legacy and that historic legacy have a great deal of overlap, and perhaps we should look at what's happening in the ecological legacy. And so for the past 15 or 20 so years, what we've been looking at is what has happened? What assemblages are there, and what are they doing? Is there risk associated with the contaminants, which are primarily metals, and there are some special problems. I mean, if you go into the Guadalajara Canal or the Bronx River, there are some special problems you have to deal with. You know, chromium was one of those issues. But for the most part, what we've seen is an assemblage of natural plants and animals that have colonized and are utilizing the resources of that area in a way that the data tells us is actually mitigating the risk of transfer of those contaminants. You know, it's Barry Commoner's fourth law of ecology. Nature knows best. And so what we're doing in terms of design today, and what I think we see in many landscape architecture programs today, is honoring some of the natural systems that have inherent natural processes that actually know best. And so today we've gotten away from the Olmsted control type of a model, and we're looking much more at a natural process. And once again, it is the people of the park that are making that happen. They are the ones that are the stewards. They are the ones that are going and doing the minor cleanups.
Do they do maintenance and things like that? That's fantastic.
In terms of stewardship activities alone, the volunteers to the park provide about $1 million worth of hours a year at minimum wage.
Wow.
Yeah, just for even cleaning up the trash.
Just for cleaning up the trash and things, but the more active part of that is the plantings. Is getting involved in soils that they can, soils that are not contaminated, or going in and looking at the composition of natives and non-natives and looking at those communities and seeing where they can make a difference in those communities. So the community connection to the park has never been stronger, but it's come from a perspective of trying to understand what the land is actually telling them, rather than them forcing what they think should be the end output of the land.
And part of that is you work with Margie Ruddick, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so for people who aren't aware of her, she is, you must know her, Bill, right? I mean, she is a landscape architect who has committed herself to working in this way for a long time with community people, right? Has it been an organic kind of?
It was.
I don't know how long Marty was involved in it, but I know she's been involved in a number of other kinds of circumstances like that. And people often say to me, "So why are you different from a landscape architect?" And because I think about things in a very different way. First of all, I'm not hired. I'm not a business. You know, usually I pick the places I want to work. And I do it from a much more grassroots, rather than grassroots up and rather than top down. But I'm very curious about what it was like to work with her and how she works with the people in the park.
This is an interesting story. Margie's a special person. And when the golf course was going forward, you know, I thought, you know, we're going to lose something that's really special that's happening here. So I had a couple of grad students go out and do a really thorough inventory of what actually existed on this old barren railroad. And the diversity values were just incredible. And so when the governor says, hey, this is a natural area, and we need a plan for it now, and we're fortunate enough that at that time Margie was doing some work for the Science Center, so we got a hold of Margie, and we got together, and I showed her this inventory, and she says, this is wonderful. Let's design around the inventory.
What's already there.
What's already there, include that. Yes, we can make changes, we can, you know, show where the paths are going, and we can bring people to those areas that highlight the functions of these ecologies, you know, in a way that makes them part of it. And so she was able to bring that piece where we had a landscape, we had done the inventory that allowed us to understand where the true values were, and now Margie comes along and makes the people connection. So it was a...
She was there while they were planting, and she was on the site?
No, I did all the site work.
Oh, you were there?
Yeah,
you were there.
I did all the site work, but Margie did the planting. Yeah. Yeah.
So she would give plans to the local involved people, and you would make sure that they got planted correctly, etc. Yeah. So you were the project manager in a way. Yeah, because I do that job too, which is a big job.
If anybody has some questions, I think this would be a great time to start that conversation. And also I wanted to just point out, this is a 60-minute tape. And she's going to have to change the tape at some point. And so you're going to give me a little heads up and then we might have like a 2-second break.
Okay.
Fills that up. So if anybody would like to jump in with a question right now, that would be fabulous. Did you? Yes.
No, I'm sorry. I was saying hello.
Oh, okay. I actually have a question about how you have to work with the government, because it seems to me like both of you are having these kind of engagements from different perspectives. And I'm wondering what that's like and what that requires of you.
I've recently retired from parks and I'm just working in academia. But, you know, I've often thought of the structure of DEP and have
Department of Environmental
protection, which is over that side of the river, which is statewide, not the citywide.
Right, the statewide in our neck of the woods is the
Okay.
Department of Environmental Conservation,
Right.
DEC.
And I've often had run-ins, and I've known almost all the commissioners, and I've often thought of it as sometimes it's like the evil empire, right?
Mm.
And there's Darth Vader at the head of it, you know? And there's some truth to that at certain periods in time. I won't go into the specific periods of time, but you know, there's also an interesting process if you've worked, as I had the opportunity to do, both in the sort of the Trenton realm and in the political realm, that, you know, on a first name basis with commissioners and knew the governor. But there's a role they're playing. And then there's this thing we call democracy. It basically elects people, and those elected people basically make decisions, and somehow you got to translate all that into a budget and allocate it through a spending plan and do all that stuff. So there's a certain role, and all that happens. And unfortunately, most people who deal in that area of government forget that that's not reality, that what happens on the land is actually reality. So while I understand, and I think there is a role for that, and unfortunately, I think the disconnect between the land and that role often becomes very wide, so there's a schism there.
I would think that's a real problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. On the other hand, you know, I've worked in the government and in academia, and there are some people that are really just dedicated to being stewards. And they've chosen that life, and they've worked for less money, and that's who they are. That's not what they do. And so there are many people in our parks, our forestry, our fishing game, our wildlife, and even some of the people in some of the permitting who are there for the right reasons. And it gets translated into a bunch of procurement policies and a bunch of regulations that often seem contradictory and impede the progress that frustrates Lillian to no end. But at the same time, it is the system that we're dealing with, and on both sides, I've met some very good people.
My feeling,
Go ahead.
can I just finish, and,
Sure,
and then
yeah.
you can, I'm happy to hear what you have to say, but my modus operandi with permitting people and the Department of Environmental Conservation has been to, this is my eternal optimism, is to treat them as if they care and they want to do the right thing. Many people put them in, even the engineers that I've worked with, put them in a position where they're the bad guys and they're the people you got to fight. My attitude is make them feel part of the process, like they're doing the right thing and that they have the potential to do the right thing. Make them part of the feel-good process, and they will be there to help you. So, I mean, I've had very good relationships with like some of the DEC commissioners. One of them, the one in Long Island, calls me his favorite squeaky wheel. You know, I'll just call him up and I'll say, Peter, you know, we've trying to do this. What can you do to help me facilitate it? And it's been amazing to me that it kind of worked in the same way in the Bronx, which is a whole nother region and a whole lot less, I'm a lot less likely to run into those people at environmental events than I would be, say, on the North Fork. But it always amazes me how much they want to do the right thing, and they want to be in a position where they feel like they're part of the process. And if you can give them that kind of sense, you'll have a lot more, you'll have your permits a lot faster, and you'll have things like what happened to us in the Bronx was that the Department of Environmental Conservation wanted our data. I mean, I specifically set up this grant so that we were working with Drexel University environmental engineering program, and they're doing testing and they're monitoring all the water in and water out, the flow that comes in, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation wants our data so that they can prove that these kinds of green infrastructure projects really work.
You know, that's happening more and more. Citizen scientists and citizen science in general is really coming to its own in today's age of technology. I mean, think about this: the gas map that you saw during Sandy for the South Jersey area, you know, which was on FEMA's website, wasn't created by FEMA. It was created by a bunch of high school kids with iPhones.
Wow.
That's how that happened.
Yeah.
You know, so that has real value, and it's allowing us to become, you know, much more involved as a public.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Oh, I think part of what I had to ask has been answered, but there's another part of, you were talking about the stewardship of the population being more involved with these systems so that they're more functional. And what I see through the work I've seen Ruth do and Lillian do, and now I'm seeing you're doing and others, there's a great deal of ignorance in the general population, and they're really willing to, if you tell them that, for example, natural gas is the cleanest burning fuel that you can get, they will say, okay, that's fine, let's go do natural gas, and or there's a way to solve this problem or that problem if you just let us do that, then the majority of the population is going to back up and say, okay, that's fine. There is more and more and more activism, but how do you see a resolution for that, other than what you've already just talked about?
Now, you brought a good point up, that there is a lack of awareness in the general populace about true environmental issues. How we get there, you know, most people will say, well, it's through education. But as Leopold said, is it the amount of education that we need, or the type of education that we need? And I believe very strongly it's the type of education that we need, and that our educational system, number one, should never end when you're 18 or 35 or 99. And number two, it should be place-based. It should be part of a structure that connects the student to their own backyard. One of the things that frustrated me to no end when I was dealing with the New Jersey curriculum was that it mandated that in 4th grade, the students had to be taught about the tropical rainforests of South America. Because this was back in the era when, you know, the rainforests are still disappearing as fast as they ever were, but it was publicly, it was a big thing back then, right? Perceptually. And so I'm sitting there thinking, I said, well, here we got a kid who can identify, I don't know, you know, teak, and can identify hardwoods out of the South American forest, but they can't go in the backyard and identify their oak tree.
Yeah.
You know, there's something inherently wrong with that system. And like you say, it's taken time to change that. But I do believe that as we look through, and we've gotten past this standards humps and teaching to the test hump that we've been through now again, that place-based and environmentally significant curricula will become more evident. So that's you know, that's the one way I think we hope to get past it. There's the other way is the harder way. The other way, that is, if we don't do this, if we don't reconnect people to land in some way, that the cost of not being connected, all those costs that have been externalized to this point, you know, the cost to our health of not having clean air because we've cut down all the trees, the cost to our waterways because there's no more buffer along the rivers, those costs are going to get so great that that's when we'll pay attention again. You know, New York City is a great example of this. New York City's water, their potable water, is a system that is just a marvel. And it's a marvel primarily because New York City became so populated so fast early on that in 1831 they decided, hey, we got to build the Croton Dam up there to make sure we have clean water for the people, the 8 million people of New York City. And today you're paying those water fees for conservation easements to make sure that the septic tanks up in that Croton watershed are working right. So you not externalize that cost. You really built that cost into your system. And that's the type of thinking that the future holds for all of our natural resources. It's not ignoring it, it's not commercializing it, but we definitely can't count it as an external cost because the buffer in the system's not there anymore. We're using on average about an Earth's worth and a half of reusable natural resources every year. We can't do that forever.
What happens when that happens, like we create Croton, we create the upstate watershed that we have, we create this incredible conflict between upstate and downstate.
Right.
The conflict that happens becomes conflict. It doesn't become working together. We're not working together with the people upstate. We're taking over what was theirs and we're bringing it down here in their mind. Okay, so it's like there's going to be these ongoing conflicts, and the resolution of those conflicts are going to be what solves these problems. And instead, what we do, we set up conflict in order to take what we want. We still have this conquering attitude of how are we going to take over certain things for the better good of man.
Right.
And there's no real way. We make someone subservient in order to do this. And when you make somebody else subservient, then you have an issue. You were doing this because it's better for me.
Well, and that's true until they reach the points that the critical threshold, right? Until it reaches that point where it becomes very obvious that it's good for everybody. You know,
you have to make that point.
You've got to, and unfortunately, unless we begin to really educate in a way that's place-based and teaches to a land ethic, unfortunately, you almost have to reach that point before it changes. And I'll give you a really good example of this on a global scale. You know, from the years about 1980 through about 2005, Saudi Arabia was self-sufficient in the production of wheat. Think about that. Saudi Arabia, desert, production of wheat. How are they doing it? They were pulling up water out of the ancient aquifers to do it. Well, by 2005, it became so expensive to pump that water from 5 miles down that it was cheaper to buy wheat from Ethiopia or to buy wheat from Argentina or somewhere else. So they solved that conflict, you know, by spending a lot of money. If they don't have oil to spend that money, they have a real conflict.
They can't eat.
Right. So it will get down to the point of really looking at how we utilize our natural resources. And in many places around the globe, we've hit that wall already.
I mean, the fact that our natural resources are finite is not a new idea.
A new field,
However, it is a new paradigm for people to learn how to work with. And you know, it is one of those areas where you know, every single place you turn, especially if you're an environmentalist who is sensitive to these things, it's everywhere you look on every level. The challenge of using our natural resources more wisely and being more conscious of things. I mean, I like to quote Gus Speth from The Bridge at the End of the World. It's a wonderful writer who he was head of the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment. For many years he started the Natural Resources Conservation Defense Council, right. I get all the NRDCs and the NRCSs all right. He started that with Jimmy Carter, and he, you know, this book is really quite, it's old now, it's maybe 4 or 5 years old, but it really does put the focus on capitalism. He felt that his whole career was about, you know, getting the laws changed, etc., and that unfortunately it did not work because of capitalism. And that capitalism, I mean, now this is a whole nother conversation, but that capitalism is something that does inherently use up resources. And that's what it's about. It's not about renewing, it's about using it up. And I think that this is something, you know, that you know, we all have to face, and it's not an easy thing for people to face. And what Frank and I like to talk about, I think, is like how do you change the paradigm so that people then, if they've got this kind of grassroots connection to nature, then they kind of can make that leap.
It's enormously helpful, I think, to have that touch with nature. But, and unfortunately, I think because of capitalism and because of our structure, that gets all political. And then it gets to be the fight between, oh, I'm going to make this kind of money on this thing and that kind of money on that thing, and the two sides just don't meet.
Yeah.
But what I'm really impressed by what you're saying about the public having power. And I'm seeing that happening in a number of ways, particularly around fracking in New York State, where we have a little bit of a moratorium right at the moment, but it has a lot to do with people getting involved. And I think the way that, you know, what's important about these conversations is to know that people like you are doing these things, and I'm very encouraged by it, but I think it's a lot of effort.
Yeah,
And it goes out into, you know, into areas where you're not always getting paid, and there's not always support, and you've got
You
to
mostly
plow
don't
your
get
path.
paid. You mostly don't get paid.
Yeah, I mean, this is big.
Yeah. Well, but it's how you want to live your life. You know, what is important? What is the meaning to you know, what is the meaning to life? From my perspective, I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and feel that I'm having, there's that wonderful quote that Einstein made about if you want to have a life well lived, don't connect yourself to things or people. Connect yourself to big ideas, you know, to big issues. And I think, am I correct in that quote?
That's beautiful. We're going to do a film break for exactly 30 seconds.
The big ideas of our time are, you know, how do we go forward? So please, do you want to moderate the questions?
Yes, let's go. Who's got some questions? Yes, Phil.
Oh yeah, you mentioned education as being very important. I think that in this type of work practice, getting people closer to nature is a very experiential-based type of education that I think really pays off very well for people to see true experiences in nature. That's why I think design professionals who push the envelope to really create those true experiences are very, very important. People learn a lot from this. And that's why I also think that regulatory officials like the DEC or planning boards or whoever's in charge of regulations of these areas really relate to design professionals who come with big ideas to really restore the area to a true, you know, experience beyond what they normally experience with entities who are required to work with them for mitigation or some other reason. These entities are typically just trying to meet the minimum requirements to get the project done. But design professionals who are visionary are much more appealing to work with because DEC can actually, or regulatory officials can actually see that they're going to get that true experience or reach that true experience that people can have in natural areas. I guess my question is, in the Liberty State Park and other areas, some people learn technically, or people learn more like through economy. So is there any kind of analysis or research being done on the ecosystem services that these natural areas provide, and versus like natural areas versus specifically kind of also like big lawn areas?
There's in fact, that's my research today is in that field. So the first part of your question, though, reminds me of a kind of a saying that I think is very true, that we retain about 10% of what we hear, about 20% of what we see, and about 90% of what we do. So you hit that right, you nailed that on the head. In terms of the ecosystem services that are provided by these urban systems, which are in many ways impaired in some way or the other, are very interesting. Number one, I'll just give you a brief example of this. I just finished this paper, writing this paper. If we look at what the value in terms of carbon sequestration of a naturally assembled urban forest is, and we compare that to, say, a hectare of forest in the Pine Barrens, which is close enough to be comparable, right? And we look at the amount of carbon that's sequestered, there is no difference. It's absolutely the same. And put this on top of the fact that you're in an area where the CO2 concentration around the park is probably in the neighborhood of 400 parts per million, right? Rather than the 390 or so, which is ambient, right? That becomes even that much important in that area. So I think that if you look at the services and how they function, in many cases, you can show with data that they're functioning at a very high level. And then you surround it with the context of the impairment that surrounds it and say, look what we're improving here, it makes it even more important. So in my mind, you have more people that can connect with it more readily, and you have a context where it's actually more important.
But also what you're working on is like, it's a question of values, right? I mean, there are ecological values, and there are actually, you've been able to make some sort of financial values that are connected to these things, so that you can show people that, okay, this was one of Gus Beth's really big issues, was that you can show people that, you know, doing the right thing in the long run will allow there to be more financial reward, less health problems, less, you know, just connecting the dots for people so that they can see the results are definitely, they can be monetized. I guess when I look on your website it says monetized.
Oh yeah, it can. If you look at the 5 million people that visit Liberty State Park on an annual basis, which is probably about, what, 20% of what you get in Central Park in New York City,
Really?
right? Yeah.
Wow.
I think that's up around 25. So if you look at the 5 million people and then you do a money generation model on that, it turns out that those visitors are driving about $350 million into the economy annually for that 1,000 acres of green space. Now that's the second most visited state park in the nation. So it's a very high visitation. But in terms of water quality, in terms of air quality, in terms of your physical and psychological health, you know, those are not even factored into that equation. This is the direct driver of people buying gas, people buying shoes, people, you know, buying food at the place and staying overnight to go see the Statue of Liberty and that type of thing. So from an economic perspective, it makes sense. And if we think, as Lillian just said, in the long term rather than the short term, I believe it makes sense even in the private sector. That in our future development, opening these areas up, creating green spaces that have ecological value in terms of stormwater, but also give people a sense of place and a reason to want to be in those places.
You have to make people care.
Care, exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really what I think my work is about, is to make these, sometimes there are green infrastructure projects that are not really thought of in an aesthetic way. And there are millions of dollars spent on stormwater remediation that nobody even knows are there. The people who live next door don't even know what they're doing. So there's like this tremendous opportunity. One of the things that I like the best about the science that's being done at the ABC project is that Drexel has an online, I can give you the coordinates to it if you contact me later. We have an online, real-time measuring how the flow of the water is going and how long it stays in the wetland and how long the plants can take up, you know, do the filtering processes and take up the nitrogen and the phosphorus, and how much sap is running in the plants, and, you know, a lot of really very interesting information that is proof of how it functions. Because, I mean, there's still a lot of people out there who don't believe, like Frank and I do, that, you know, that these low impact development solutions or green infrastructure solutions, that they work just as well as putting in 10 French drains and having culverts and, you know, hard surfaces, that they are a lot more cost effective, and that they're a lot more likely to make people care. They're a lot more likely to invite people into the environment, and that they really are more cost-effective and functional to approach things this way.
I have a question. Do you know how much, well, how much of the water runoffs have asphalt in them? Because that is actually carcinogenic.
Well, asphalt is the majority of our hard surface, our hardscape of the city, you know, so that's, and it's a petroleum product.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that water that falls on our city streets and picks up the asphalt and
out to the river.
goes right out into the, through the sewer system into the rivers.
But I've
And
heard-
combined-
Don't forget that if you, and I think what Lillian is arguing here is for green infrastructure that mitigates some of those contaminant issues.
Mhm.
You know, in the place that I work in, we know the soil is contaminated. But the plants that have survived there because they have mitigation strategies inherent
like
to those
that.
plants. So that if you look at arsenic, for example, which is high in many areas of the park, arsenic in the plants that naturally assemble there does not translocate, does not get past the roots into the aerial section plants. It doesn't go there
Really?
It's used.
because the plants that translocated died.
Mhm.
So there's a natural system here
Survival of the fittest.
there's a natural system here that's working. You know,
What are those plants? I'm just curious.
It wouldn't have,
I want to know those
you
arsenic plants.
know, I'll tell you, birch trees and poplar trees can grow almost anywhere. And a lot of traditional architecture would say, okay, we're coming into this urban area, we have a bunch of, okay, let's get rid of them and let's plant this, right? And that's been sort of the command and control system. And then you say, look at where is this growing? And what are the soils? And that's what's dictating what's growing. And what value are these birch trees? And I'll tell you, in my mind, a grove of birch trees, especially the gray birch with a lighter bark to it, has just as much aesthetic appeal as anything we can plant there, and far more than the calorie pear would. So the idea that we can actually honor these systems and move them from the sort of Eurotrash symbol we used to give them into where they're actually aesthetically appealing. And that's what a good landscape architect can do. They can actually bring people to areas and shape the experience so that people begin to value these services that are being provided by these landscapes.
I'm sorry, I was going to ask another question. Any of you want to ask a question?
No, I'd like to make a comment. There is a lot being done. I mean, I've only been in New York for 20 years now, and I've worked in Brooklyn for the whole 20 years. There's a lot being done by the state and by the DEC and the DEP and all of that to go in and clean up these areas. The Meeker Avenue plume, as it's called, which is polluting Newtown Creek and all of that stuff. There's been millions of dollars invested into how to resolve that and how to solve it. And I've watched that happen to the point of the people from the State Department of Environmental Conservation and the health departments would literally go door to door and invite people into meetings and explain to them what's going on in the neighborhood, what's going on underneath, how it can be fixed and how it can be helped, and all the things that they're trying to do to work on it. There's a lot of cleanup that's been happening, and this is not new. I mean, they've been draining reservoirs in upstate, up the Housatonic River and Hudson River and stuff like that from the chemicals, that, the PCBs that GE and all of that was putting in. I mean, this whole reservoir's been cleaned up, and that's happening now in Brooklyn and here in, you know, greater New York City. There's a huge effort on by the government to try to clean this stuff up. And they're very open and active to people dropping a dime and saying, I see this going on. And they're down with, you know, 2 boots on the ground and a hammer in their hand. And we're going to fix the problem or we're going to run you out of town. And I've watched them put businesses out. I've watched them go in and clean stuff up. There's a lot of government effort trying to do this. I mean, all the little things that people are doing with putting in parks and all of that stuff is great, but there's other work behind there that's helping this all to happen.
But you know how that's coming about?
Yeah,
It's because people are requesting it, people are demanding it, people are saying, we need this. And that's what you want to encourage is people's active participation.
You brought up, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but you brought up a very good point. Wayne has brought up a very good point here. And the truth is that those big efforts are absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
The other truth is that we haven't put a dime into the Superfund that cleans up the Superfund account, since that cleans up the nasty of these in the past decade. That's the truth. The other truth about what's happening along, especially along our waterfronts, is that more and more of these industrial lands are becoming available. And the bottom line is that if we were to take the approach of command and control cleanup and go in and pull out all the soil, start all over again for every one of those sites, even the richest country in the world couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And so we're faced with this issue today of how do we re-envision our former industrial landscapes. And at what point do we need to say, okay, let's put the fence up, let's put the hazardous sign on top of that fence and keep people out? Or when do we need the people to say that we want, understanding the ecological and health risks associated with those areas, we need to be involved in that process, and we want to help clean it up.
To be part of it.
And be part of it.
Yeah.
So that's the dividing point we're on at now, because to be perfectly honest, the money that is cleaning up the PCBs out of the harbor today, which fortunately after 30 years of litigation is now coming from General Electric, you know?
Yeah.
But the money's to do that for all the orphan sites
Right.
Coming from our taxpayer dollars.
doesn't exist anymore. And so we've got to be very active, very proactive about making this the people's problem, not the government's.
A priority, yeah. I just really believe in activism. I really believe the more you can be involved, the more you can make your voice heard, the more likely problems are to be solved.
I just have to interject something here about the DEC that concerns me, because I've been very involved in fracking, but they are only allowing right now a 4,000-foot buffer from the New York City watershed, and they're going to actually allow drilling, the horizontal drilling, go underneath the 4,000-foot buffer. So that's the kind of latest and greatest, and the DEC is really dropping the ball on this, because there are plumes of methane that go at least 7 miles. That's not 4,000 feet. And actually larger than that would be necessary. So the kind of water contamination that's happening on hydrofracking across the country is actually quite serious and very contaminating, and going to be really difficult to address over time, because this stuff is not going to just stay down there. And so, you know, yes, I do think the DEC has some good ideas and so forth, but this is one that they're not on top of, and these conversations don't get out in the general public.
I know, ma'am, you've been trying to ask a question for a while.
Well, you know, I'm not being too assertive about it, because I can't, you know, it's a question that's going to be very difficult for you to answer. Both of you have said how important it is for people to be, for us to make people aware of what's important ecologically, and to have a sense of place and to become involved in that. And my issue was a very simple one. I had 200 trees planted through a Parks Department program in my neighborhood several years back. And I can't get people to water them. I managed myself to be able to speak to the individual homeowners. I got permits from signatures from 200 people. I worked with the Parks Department. They were actually great, the Division of Street Trees. It did take a long time, but we got the trees. But all of that, whatever it is, you know, it was a lot of talking to individuals. It's it's just, it feels really like people are just not going to water the trees. And a lot of them, of course, the street tree survival record is not fantastic. I think over 50% don't survive, and so I think, well, maybe I should just expect that. But do you have any magic ideas about really local things that one, I mean, particular techniques that you like to employ? Do people come in from outside? You know, those kinds of things.
You want to go first?
Well, two things along those lines. One is that, you know, all the models for climate change predicts it's actually going to get wetter here, so you may be in luck. Oh. That's sort of usurping the problem, though. The other is that we've traditionally looked at a suite of trees for planting in the urban settings that could tolerate things like being bumped into the car and stuff like that. And there's much more research today on xeric or dry area plantings, and to get sort of a more natural assemblage that would tolerate those periods of drought better. I think we've got to move sort of our planting suite, what we look at in what areas, to a much more natural assemblage than one that's been one that's been sort of chosen for the aesthetics of an improved urban environment.
Yeah, there are certainly better trees to choose. I'm always appalled when I see trees that are planted which are non-natives, that are not really designed to survive in our kind of brutal area. If anybody's familiar at all with that wonderful piece that Sonfus did, the Time Garden in the West Village. That was done in the 70s. He took an area, do you know this work? Yeah, he took an area in a part of a city block and he planted native plants. Now in the 70s, the Parks Department said these plants will never survive. These are not on our list of approved plants. Well, now they are, because they did survive, and they did survive to a certain extent. It could look a lot better than it does if he had the same feeling that I do about my work, which is that it's never done, and that I can never walk away, and that every time I go by, if I see something, I have to be involved again. But Alan doesn't necessarily look at the piece in that way. But I think that there are programs like Adopt a Tree, where you can work with school groups and just plant the seed in your local junior high school. That the science teachers would love to have projects like that their kids can be involved with, where they actually do have responsibility for a tree. I mean, I think it's a big challenge for a lot of areas. I'm working with Columbus Avenue. They have a lot of street trees that the Business Improvement District has adopted. They're trying to get each business to adopt the tree in front of there and to take responsibility for it.
Yeah, that's where we've had most difficulty, really.
Yeah.
And
That's the most difficult.
well, yeah, there's a resistance also because people are upset about the bid for various political reasons, because it was imposed on them, so they don't want to do anything that, I mean, there's really divisions about how democratic that decision was made to have the bid, and so to bring the tree watering into that is making it another kind of top-down thing, which people don't want. Anyway, I don't need to take any more time with it. I think the school thing is a good idea. I can look into that. But it's just, in general, you were seeming to think that people really get behind these ecological things, and my feeling is that it's short-lived. In a way, they love it there, but they just won't water the trees.
They get behind it if they have ownership in it in the first place.
Yeah.
That's when they get behind it.
Yeah.
So, and in your case, if you've got 50% survival, as you mentioned, you're doing good, okay? So
That's not me, that's just the trees
things
did that on
die,
their own.
they're not all gonna make it.
Yeah.
Many times it's 10% survival, we say it's good, so.
And that's why we really do emphasize picking the right plants for the right place and using more plants that are native, because they can adapt to things. I mean, one of the things that I'm particularly interested right now is the soil content of the places that I'm working. There's a lot of research that's been done that you want 2/3 sand and 1/3 organic material, which every person who worked at ABC thought I was an idiot. Why are you planting these things in sand? They'll never survive. Well, in fact, native plants don't need those nutrients that weeds, etc., do need. So that if you use that soil mix, you'll encourage the native plants and you'll not encourage the weeds, and that's what these plants were built for, was for sand. So they're now all saying to me, those tomato gardeners are saying to me, wow, the grasses are growing, things are growing. If you choose the right plants for the right soil and the right circumstances, hopefully they will get that kind of attention. But it's a challenge. I don't want to say, I mean, we're both really optimistic people, but I don't want to say it works every time. I mean, there are a lot of parks in the Bronx now and nobody goes to them. So, it's whether, they don't even have to water the trees, but it's like putting this sense of nature in their life view that, it's the one across the way from ABC, where my park is so totally different. It's not grass, it's not active participation. It's, it's a what we call passive recreational park. but it looks out at this park that is all grass, and after 10 years it's been finished, and people are just slowly starting to come there. And you have to have, you know, you can't just expect this kind of community spirit is gonna blossom without a lot of nurturing. It's like the plants we talk about, you know, if you give it half a chance, 50% is not bad. So rejoice in your 50%.
Oh, I am.
And bless you for getting the trees. The Million Tree Program, there are a lot of tree programs out there.
That came after mine, but
Yeah.
anyway, it's
Yeah,
great to see them. It's very rewarding. Anyway, thank you.
Oh, this is great. Yes.
If I could just make a plug for an organization that I work for that deals with a lot of these issues, the City Parks Foundation, which works in partnerships with parks, but we're a private foundation, and we do place-based education. We work with grammar school, middle school, and high school kids, get them out into the parks, into the water at Hallett's Cove. We live on an island. They don't know that. And also partnerships for parks, which I don't know if you've been in touch with on your tree issue. In terms of the tree trust and educating people and really how to engage the community in issues in your neighborhood. So.
You know, the thing that I keep seeing over and over again that really is very positive and inspiring is that you know the kids get the information, and the kids bring their parents and tell their parents what's going on. I've seen this happen again and again and again, so that if you can do that kind of outreach education on a very at a very young age, that they will inform their parents about what's going on, and they'll actually drag them to places where they might not go otherwise.
See them get so excited about it. They
Yeah.
have no idea like what goes on. You know, there's roll over a log and there's decompose. There's all this dynamic stuff happening.
Yeah.
And they get so excited about it. It's really amazing.
Yeah, I'm working. I have a potential project which would be with Parks Department. I have to ask you about that. But it deals with compost. I mean, it's a compost. The Lower East Side Ecology Center has been doing composting for 25 years in New York, and the kids just go berserk over watching the worms work, and you know, it's a very grassroots kind of exposure. But you know, these are kids who, they don't get to dig in the dirt.
I've witnessed the learning gardens through the program, and it's just amazing. The kids, you know, pulling up the garlic and playing with, you know, the shovels and everything. They get the
and we want to
experience
keep
of it.
that.
We talk about experiential.
That real hands-on
The
experience
hands-on.
is part of their life thing. And I mean, because both of us, they always say that you get you scratch an environmentalist and you see a childhood spent playing. You know, there's a lot of that kind of, you know, there's a number of artists, Richard Lewin, right, who writes about, you know, getting kids out into nature and keeping them, you know, balanced life with their computer screens and their electronic diversions. Those things are really important.
Do you document your work in some way that gives it, could give it a context in a museum or in an exhibition space? And I realize I just kind of way off into all these things.
That's the hard question. I'm not interested in documentation as a museum or gallery experience. I find that is a really off-putting rather than welcoming or inspiring experience. Don't you, you know, I mean, to put up maps and whatever is, or even nice photographs of the plants in bloom is so not the experience that I want you to have. I mean, my artwork is out there in the Bronx. That's where it is. But when I do museum or gallery kinds of things, I usually do interactive installations, which do allow people to relate to the visuals in a physical kind of a way.
Like so, the Go game.
The game, yeah, Go, which is a Asian game that I use as a interface for information about wetlands and about land use management issues in various places. I did one on Long Island and I did one in the south of Spain for the Seville Biennial. Those have been really, really, I think, very effective ways of getting the work out. But, you know, to have something that goes on the wall, I'm not very good at doing that, and I'm not very interested in doing that anymore, or even making sculptural things, because the work is in the landscape, and that, to me, is more important. It makes a very strange career, I'll tell you, because they're always looking, you know, they're always looking for something easy, some nice, you know, concise way to encapsulate 4 years of work, you know? Well,
Yeah.
it just doesn't work that way. And it doesn't, every once in a while, I think Lucy Lepard always used to talk about, I've been in shows she's curated, she'd talk about that one image, you know, like the My Lai massacre image of the little girl running screaming from the Vietnamese village. I mean, like, that's an iconic image. If we could come up with the iconic image for fracking or for, you know, non-point source pollution image that would encapsulate it, it would be fantastic. But I think things are so complex now that it's really hard to do that. I mean, personally, I like the idea of taking this real-time electronic information and putting that on the wall in a museum and saying, okay, this is the piece, you know, this is what it's about. This is, the data is what's coming out of that. But then that's much more removed, once again, from the physical experience of being outside. And Frank and I have to probably admit that part of the whole point of working this way is so I can be outside. Yes. I don't want to be inside behind a computer screen all the time either.
As Edward Abbey says, you know, we're half-hearted enthusiasts. You know, the other half is saved to actually get out and mess in it ourselves, so that we don't die having missed the story.
Yeah.
But so,
I have another question. It's based on what you just said about what you've been talking about is education, but also is what you've been talking about. How then would you bring it to the public? Because not the whole public can't come and have the joy of being in that particular space that you've built.
Yeah.
So in order to educate people to come to this, how are you bringing that to, other than talks like this, etc.? What is your mass media sort of project?
I think about it a lot, Michael, and it's good that you asked that, because I think about it a lot. I mean, there is interpretive signage there. There's interpretive signage that is not normal interpretive in that it says thank you to the 500 people who were involved with making this, and pictures of them, and saying the Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, and this roof garden here, and that, you know, so I have that kind of an aspect of it right there on the site, and it is open to the public the same hours as ABC Carpet and Home is open. But the next idea I had was to have performances there. To actually do, I'm inviting Reverend Billy and the Stop Shopping Choir to sing in the wetlands, and I'm working actually with a scientist from Columbia and a choreographer to develop a dance issue around climate change. The concept of the dance would be around climate change issues, and that these things would actually be happening at the site and would be part of dancing in the streets. You know, there are a number of different kinds of programs that they could fit into. There's also an exhibition called In Climate that's being curated that I see that being part of my project. But trying to figure out ways to get the community aware of it, and I'm talking about the art community and the, you know, it's just, you know, 45 minutes on the subway, it's not that far away, and we're not used to doing those kinds of things. So I think the more events there are that happen there, the more likely there'll be more people coming and spending time there. But I also am there a lot. I'm there weeding, and when kids come through and say, oh, we've been waiting for this to open, and you know, it's so exciting. We learned about the, you know, what's happening with the fish in the river in school, and you know, we can we actually help? You know, those kinds of things happen. The more I'm there, the more it it's possible, and you get the gas station guys on the corner who say, you know, well, we'll donate this or we'll donate that. It's a very organic, growing thing. And that's why I say my work is never done.
Yeah,
I'm never finished.
There's the aspect of experiential learning, which we've discussed several times here, and I don't mean that that should be absent technology either. You know, the role of the place, of the person in the place, is to create that sense of belonging, that sense of stewardship. The role of technology is to give that stewardship a sense of scale. And I think if you use technology appropriately, you can bring people to that idea of who we are and how big our role is on this planet. So that the 2% of us, the 50% of us that now live in cities, are about 3.5 billion people, you know, occupy only 2% of the land surface. But when you see a night satellite vision of any country, you see how big that 2% actually becomes. The idea that there's only 300 million hectares of arable land on the planet, and that it's all been under cultivation for the past 20 years or so, and that there really is very little land we can put into cultivation because we can't bring in any more water. You know,
there's also a finite amount of water on Earth, and that only gets recycled.
You can see that on any Google image. The idea that we're losing 13 million hectares of forest a year and only growing 6 million hectares of forest a year is apparent in any Google image that you take of the Amazon in Brazil. So again, we can connect people to landscape, and then through technology we can scale it to understand what the impacts really are. And so I do believe there's something exciting about living now and being able to see what you mean in the context of the entire planet.
It's changing the paradigm.
Yeah, it is changing the paradigm. And maybe, you know, maybe the idea that we've lost, you know, Lily and I are coming from the same old hippie era, right? Where, you know, it was the only thing that ever matters was what the individual did, right? And then sort of the age of, I don't know, the purple dinosaur generation, or whatever you want to call it now. And I went through a real sort of interesting scenario with my students where for about 10 years, they would, at the end of the first lecture, they would come and say, you know, why should I care? I can't make a difference. You know, well, yeah, the individual is the only thing that ever really made a difference. So I think we're coming back to the idea that, you know, yes, technology has changed us incredibly. But it doesn't mean we're lost. It doesn't mean that we can't make a real difference. And maybe technology can be used to make that real difference.
How much do you think all the video programs on the environment play into people's, is it too passive? You know, sit there and watch?
Exactly. But it makes it a great teaching tool, because I can, if I need a today piece on almost any environmental issue, all I got to do is go to YouTube. Right? And it's out there, right? It's out there.
But what good is it really doing? I mean,
well, I think what it does is it gives there's information there.
Yeah.
Then it becomes sort of our job, at least as an educator, it becomes the job to put that in context.
Yeah.
And to contextualize it so that it makes sense to the individual and it has an impact on what they're doing. So, you know, nobody charged YouTube or video games with the idea of making a difference in a person's life. No, they were making money off that. That's all that's there for. But I think we have the opportunity to change the way we look at that.
okay.
But it's also the media that the new generation understands and connects to first. So it's actually like throwing a worm out and trying to catch a fish. You have to put the right worm on the fish, and this is something that they have affinity for and they understand.
Yeah.
So it's something we need to understand how to use better in order to get them away from it.
Yeah.
Not to say that they won't use it to understand bigger global context things, because I think that's exactly right. The scale of the operation is easily understood by the amount of information is translated through a certain media type. But I think it's also, we have to understand how people learn these days in order for them to continue to understand what's important, because it's that media is being bombarded with things that will make their minds be interested in other aspects of the world that ignorance is bliss, but ignorance also is hurting us in some way.
Yeah, I also get that kind of feedback sometimes with my interactive games, which, you know, they're like allowing somebody to be inside the Doñana National Park, which is 100,000 acres in the south of Spain that, you know, most people never visit. Even people 30 miles away in the village, in the town of Seville, in the city of Seville, never visited that park. So, but I think you can have like immersive experiences certainly with video and with other things that do allow people to feel like they're part of it, or to want to be part of it. And at least a cab driver who came, you know, who I told about my project, who came to see the museum, said to me at the opening, "I will go now and look at this amazing place which is near me. And why do you come from New York City and care more about this than I do?" You know, that idea was so huge for them. I was just shocked at how many people had never been there, and it's 30 miles away from Seville. So, but those kinds of immersive experiences are possible, whether you're doing it from a physical point of view or whether you're sitting in front of your screen. But you want, I mean, the inspiration is to get people to want to go there and to want to be out there and be part of it. That's why I believe, actually, even though I've had this wonderful opportunities to do a project in Spain and to do one in Alaska, I want to work in my own backyard. I want to work here because that's where it's possible to have the deepest impact and not be virtual, not be doing it via email and, you know, trying to interview people on Skype and whatever. I think it is like it's a local thing. I mean, do you have a new project? Would you be thinking about another place, or you feel like this is your life's work?
No, I'm here.
Yeah.
The wetlands project that we're working on today to build that is the next step. You know, we've built several of them already. We'll build another one, and working in and around the harbor provides such a rich context that I don't have to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's invaluable to put what we're doing here at a bigger scale. And so that, you know, the papers that I write, you folks will never read. They're in some scientific journal, you know, and they'll sit there and the scientists talk to each other, and, you know, that's how it goes. But the people that make a difference, you know, are the folks that are actually living on the land, the folks that care about it and have an emotional attachment to it. And so that's the other side, and I think it's a good place to be.
You all wanted to add to this. I feel like
I want to go outside. It's a beautiful day. Thank you, Ruth.
I think this has been really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.